Hello there. I'm Bob Kagan. I'm a professor emeritus of political science and law from the University of California, Berkeley. And I'd like to tell you about a publication that I have in Regulation and Governance. It's entitled Scenes from a Sociolegal Research Career, an Informal Memoir. As that title indicates, this is not a typical regulation and governance article. It's not an essay with a thesis and some empirical data and a logically supported conclusion. Instead, it's a personal memoir. It's a narrative. It's a narrative that tells the story of my whole research career. So rather than a single study, this memoir summarizes a series of socio-legal research projects I conducted over a 40-year period. They're field research projects. They're research projects about regulatory enforcement and about regulatory compliance and about how American legal and regulatory processes differ from their counterparts in other economically advanced democracies. My series of research projects began in the late 1960s and early 70s, when the United States and Western Europe were in political and cultural turmoil. I was in graduate school, and the United States Congress was enacting a big wave of ambitious regulatory statutes, and the modern regulatory state was just being born. Yet at that time, there were few, if any, systematic, empirical studies of regulatory agencies and regulatory processes. From a scholarly perspective, the regulatory state was virgin territory. So my memoir describes how I set out, like an anthropologist approaching a remote tribe. I wanted to describe what regulatory officials did and how they dealt with hard cases and the pressures that shaped their actions and how regulation was experienced by regulated entities. And that's what I continue to do throughout my career in all the studies that are mentioned in this memoir. The article's subtitle, An Informal Memoir, is meant to signal my effort to write it in a style that's accessible to readers who are not scholars of regulation and governance, or who are not scholars at all. The memoir is structured as a series of scenes, brief descriptions of where I was when I was doing the research. In one scene, for example, I was in an overheated apartment in New Haven, Connecticut, shadowing a housing code inspector. In a subsequent scene, I was also in a hot place, an aluminum smelter near New Orleans, asking the director of workplace safety about his experience with OSHA inspectors, and so on through a total of 17 scenes. In each scene, I also tell about how the research project in question came about, what stimulated the idea that underlay it. For my PhD research, for example, the stimulus was an insight I got while watching President Nixon on television announcing a nationwide wage and price freeze. For another project, decades later, the stimulus was an invitation to write a paper on a subject that I hadn't previously dealt with. And many scenes also mention how the research project intersected with my family life and with my teaching life. Taking all the scenes together, therefore, you might consider the whole memoir a case study of how a scholarly career unfolds, how one project can lead to another, and how knowledge gradually accumulates, and how research does or does not cohere and hang together. Each scene also contains a summary of what I learned from each project. And there are far too many studies mentioned and too many sets of findings to summarize them all right now. But I'd like to mention two recurrent sets of findings that came up in project after project. The first set of findings is about the role in the American regulatory system of what I have labeled adversarial legalism in my books and articles. Regulation in the United States is not uniformly legalistic and adversarial, far from it. Experienced American regulatory officials, I learned in my field research, prefer flexible rule interpretation, flexible enforcement. They want to do what's sensible and effective in the particular situation. They want to elicit the cooperation of the regulated business, if at all possible. And they like to resort to legal measures to sanctions only if provoked. Nevertheless, by and large, American regulation is much more legalistic and adversarial than regulation in other economically advanced democracies. American laws and regulations and regulatory permits are far more detailed. They're more prescriptive. They're more jurisdictionally complex. They're more procedurally cumbersome. And that legal complexity makes American regulation considerably more costly to comply with, more frustrating for regulated entities. Moreover, regulations in the United States more often are enforced legalistically, that is, inflexibly. Consequently, regulation in the U.S. more often is perceived to be unreasonable. And that perception of unreasonableness, in turn, makes regulation in the United States more politically controversial than it is in other economically advanced democracies. And that, in turn, that controversial quality means that regulation is more frequently and more fiercely contested in the courts in the United States. And in the United States, the courts are not shy about challenging regulators' judgments. The higher level, higher incidence of legal conflict in the United States doesn't mean that regulation, that legal resistance and that legal conflict is the everyday norm for most regulated entities. The memoir also deals with a series of studies of regulatory compliance. Taken together, and this is the second set of recurrent findings that I'd like to mention. Taken together, this study suggests that as in other rich democracies, most American business firms accept the legitimacy of most regulations and comply with most of them most of the time. There are, to be sure, a lot of bad apples, and they do a lot of harm, but they are a small minority of regulated entities. Why do the majority of regulatory firms comply? That was a subject of much of my research. And my colleagues and I, in our field research, found little or no evidence that regulated businesses exemplify the economic model of the firm, that they carefully calculate the cost of compliance as compared with the cost of getting caught for a violation. Rather, we found that compliance gets a large boost from several factors. First, from social pressures. Most business managers want to build and preserve their firm's reputation for being a good corporate citizen and to preserve their own personal reputation as a good citizen. Compliance also gets a boost from many managers' internalized sense of duty, their felt duty to obey the law, and their felt duty to avoid doing harm to people and to the environment. But government regulations and the threat of enforcement provide a necessary foundation on which those social pressures and normative impulses are built. The regulatory standards are essential because they crystallize social norms. They make them specific. And regulatory rules provide specific benchmarks for individual consciences. And the regulations provide standards against which social activists can measure corporate performance and criticize firms that fall short. And the regulatory standards require the gathering and the reporting of data that allow social activists to see whether firms are complying. And so the regulations are absolutely essential. And most importantly, when compliance is very expensive, we found, as when the pulp and paper mills we studied had to install multi-million dollar secondary treatment plants for their chemical-filled effluent. This is what my colleagues and I wrote. Only specific regulatory requirements, and the threat of enforcement could trump the paper mill's tight economic constraints by making a credible implicit promise to each pulp mill. You have to make a huge investment in environmental technology, but believe me, your competitors will have to as well. The investments that most firms have to make to comply with regulations also explain one of our most interesting findings. In one study, we informed company officials about another company in their industry which had committed a serious environmental violation and had been prosecuted and had been severely punished. The company officials we told that applauded what happened to the other firm. They were like a driver on the highway, having been passed by a car moving at reckless speed, who inwardly cheers when she eventually sees that the speeder is stopped at the side of the road, getting a ticket from a highway patrol officer. To conclude, I give David Levy-4 a huge amount of credit for his unorthodox step of inviting me to submit this memoir for publication. This invitation, I think, reflected David's recognition that the contributors to regulation and governance, along with all of those who provide peer review services, constitute a community. We are a community that shares a commitment to careful scholarship, and combine that commitment to careful scholarship is combined with a drive to discover when and how regulation effectively and efficiently advances the public interest. We have a lot in common. And so my hope is that the publication of this memoir will initiate a tradition of reflection on the history and the characteristics of the regulation and governance community itself. Thank you very much.